This this is Lansing Online News Radio. You're listening to LCC Radio, WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. And tonight we're going to be visiting with Emily Dievendorf, who is the Executive Director of Michigan Equality. But before we get started on that topic, Bill and I have a number of announcements tonight, and I can start with one. Our good friend Todd Haywood has his friend Sean Strobe in, and he is the founder of Paz Magazine. And they're going to be right now, starting right now from 7 o'clock until 9 o'clock at Sir Pizza in Old Town. And they're going to be talking about sort of advocacy related to the issue. One of Mr. Straub's major issues is HIV criminalization, so he's going to be talking about that. They're going to be talking about LGBT issues in the state and public health issues related to that, and also give a bit of a history on the magazine that he's done. He spoke in my journalism class earlier today and was telling the students about how you found your own magazine and what that's like. He has since sold the publication. First, he left the publication and his sister ran it, and now she has sold it, but it's been a very successful publication. What we're seeing, I think, is it sort of anticipated the web, that it was able to reach a defined audience in a way that may not have been possible before digital media came along and made that more affordable.
Is it online magazine only?
It's mostly online now. It had started out as print,
paper? Mm-hmm.
But it's one of those that's making the transition into becoming primarily online.
How do they make money?
I'm not sure what their model is. I bet they do they're heavily subsidized by people who are donors, so that's a good model for them. Now, in a similar vein, we've heard from Melissa Day Hasbrook about upcoming things here in the community related to women's issues. And I have a press release here that's for the events. There's actually, it's called Healing with Community, Thriving in Unity. And it's an event series honoring the victims of sexual violence. And there are a number of events coming up. Starting on March 15th, series kickoff. That is the Dear Sister Letters from Survivors of Sexual Violence. That's going to be a book reading, and that's going to be at the Everybody Reads bookstore, and that's 7 p.m. on the 15th, and that's the kickoff event for the series. Next in the series on the 18th is the Dear Sister Book Club at 12 noon, which is also at Everybody Reads. That's a discussion forum there. Now, the following day on the 19th at 7 p.m., there is a college workshop for MSU's Sexual Assault Crisis Intervention Team. And I'm not sure on the details of that. It's called Heart to Art, and I'm not sure quite where that's located. But I think people are going to have to kind of maybe search for that.
Is there a website?
There's got to be a Facebook page or something for that that's going to be useful.
Now, this is the program Melissa built basically from scratch, didn't she? Or she put a lot of different components together.
Some components are run by different groups. Most of the artistic and reading pieces are ones that she has created, and so she brought them all together under this umbrella so that there's a series of events during this sort of month-long effort to draw attention to the issue of sexual violence. There are sometimes domestic violence components as well. You're going to find the Clothesline Project. That's sponsored by the Firecracker Foundation now, and that's March 23rd, 3 p.m. And the last I knew, that is at the NEO Center in Lansing. I'm not quite sure where the NEO Center is, NEO. It used to be on campus, and I know they had a separate one on campus as well. I believe, let's see, the date on that is the 23rd. The Take Back the Night. Take Back the Night is a very interesting event where survivors tell their stories. And that's not going to be until April 15th. And that's going to be at Beaumont Field. What they often do is take the Clothesline Project, and it appears in more than one place. So they'll probably also have that up out at the Take Back the Night events. But we'll keep listeners apprised of the things coming up. But
how long has Take Back the Night been going on? It seems like a couple decades almost.
Yeah, it has been. It's an interesting event. It's one of those where when I was coordinating the Victims in the Media program, you have to be careful because people come there to share stories, and it's hard for the media to cover that because some people only want to do that if they can do that anonymously and in confidence, so we have to be sensitive to that. But it's an opportunity for people to come down and share their stories, personal stories, and it's a really healing event because you're surrounded by a number of other people who are very supportive, so it works really well. Now, you've got an event, or do I have another event?
No, I don't.
Coming up? Oh, you have the Wolves.
It's a boring week. Yours is the Wolves.
I have to tell you about the Wolves. At 3:15 at the Capitol this Thursday in the room 405, they're going to be holding a press conference, the people who are trying to save Michigan's Wolves. They've succeeded in getting enough signatures on their ballot petition to get the issue back on the ballot again. As you know, there's been a sort of checkered history of what happened with this legislation here in Michigan. Um, Unfortunately, there was a lot of misinformation that went out about the real status of wolves in Michigan, and it led to a vote that reauthorized hunting and trapping of wolves in Michigan. And Jill Fritz and her group are really trying to make sure that that is no longer the case. Wolves were taken off the federal endangered species list, which was probably, many people think, premature. And many of the reasons that it was able to have a comeback was because of legislation, as we had in Michigan, that was banning these kinds of practices. So there are many people who are concerned about that issue. So if you care about that, you're going to want to show up at 3:15 on Thursday and listen to what they have to say. I'm sure it's going to be quite a pitched battle coming up for the November
The
election.
last time they did that, they brought a drum fest.
Oh,
They
that's
do the
right.
drumming, because a lot of, as you know, a lot of Indian tribes are very interested in preserving the wolf.
Is that the Idle No More group that's involved in that issue? Or they?
Yes,
Are
I think
they?
it was, yes.
Okay.
From LCC, the people from LCC were there, I remember.
Because Idle No More was also involved in the Enbridge protests.
Yes,
And I went last Thursday for the sentencing in front of Judge Collette and did another video. Those of you who might be interested, you'll find that the video is on YouTube. Just look under My Cats 3 and you'll see the sentencing hearing that took place out there. And we were very happy to find that Judge Collette sentenced them to time served, so they were released that day. What we were unhappy to find out is that each one of the three women, Vicki Hamlin, Barbara Carter, and Lisa Leggio, are all facing fines of $47,000 apiece. And what this is really designed to do is to chill nonviolent protest. They didn't do anything except chain themselves to an earth mover out in Stockbridge, and the idea was that they would slow down the progress of the Enbridge Oil Company rebuilding the pipeline that carries tar sands that caused so much trouble when it spilled into the Kalamazoo River. It's still the largest online spill ever. So those three women very bravely chained themselves to that. As we've had them on the radio show talking about that experience, it was quite, I mean, they really didn't know if they were going to be injured and being removed from the
pretty
machinery.
scary for them. Now, how did they assess the fines? I mean, did he give a
This
sort of
wasn't
reason?
even fines. The Enbridge company could have asked for damages. This doesn't even include damages from Enbridge. Enbridge was willing to forego charging that. These are just simply considered court costs and fines. And there will be separate hearings on these, which are going to keep them in court forever, fighting these fines. And when you look at somebody, I mean, Barbara, I assume, is under 30, for example, this is the kind of thing that's going to hang over you for decades if it continues. There's no realistic way. I don't think she can take it out of petty cash, nor can
No.
a simple
That's a lot.
Kickstarter or GoFundMe take care of it. So I was very disappointed as well. I would really appreciate it if people would take a moment to listen to the video that I did, because Judge Collette's opening remarks really bothered me. He looked at the press, I was in the press box, and he talked about how, well, how come you never hear from murder cases? If I were doing a case about torturing an animal, you'd be here, but how come you would come out for something like this? Well, from the perspective of the three women who do this as a principled matter, they're not out to just cause trouble or be anti-corporate. They're trying to draw attention to the issue that they feel that this reliance on fossil fuels is literally killing life on the planet. You know, we're in the middle of the sixth massive die-off ever in the history of the planet, a lot of it caused by climate change and global warming. And they are willing to literally put their lives on the line to draw attention to this issue. And I felt he trivialized what they were doing and treated nonviolent protest as if it was beneath contempt. And I thought that was an odd position for a judge to take, because it would seem to me that if I were a judge, I would have far more sympathy for nonviolent protesters than murderers.
Oh, absolutely. You know, tomorrow I hope to interview Congressman John Lewis, who was part of the civil rights movement in the 60s in the South. And if they would have done things like that, which I'm surprised they didn't, frankly, he'd still be paying off his debt. He got arrested 45 times. It's nonviolent situations.
And
Nonviolent from his standpoint. He was beaten several times and put in the hospital.
I was going to say he was the subject. He was
Yeah.
the victim of so much
Yeah.
violence. Yeah.
But it's a different era, totally different era now. And I don't quite get what $47,000 buys the state in a way.
I don't either. I mean, if that's really what I mean, I'm assuming they're assessing all of the trial costs against them.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that the state years ago, in fact, I didn't get into it the last time, but
Years ago, I was accused of allowing one of my dogs to pee on a bush in the neighboring cemetery. Led to a 3-day jury trial.
You and Harlow.
And the prosecutor was immediately humiliated
Soon to
when
be a
the
baby.
only witness, right? I had a doggy lineup. We're talking, I had a lineup that I had done of little doggy Polaroids, right? He said, well, I can't really tell who's who because I'm not so good with my colors and my eyes aren't too good. So the only witness had no idea whose dogs they were. Every time animal control would come out, my dogs would be laying asleep on the couch. Some other dog was out there. I don't know whose dog it was. Mine was the dog originally, but I started keeping them in so they didn't go up there. And but they were threatening me with 6 months in jail and having the dogs destroyed. And since they weren't my dogs, there was no way I could ever prove it unless I went to court. So I said, okay, we'll go to court. They refused to settle. They refused to say it wasn't me. So the county, has been willing to waste a few resources from my
Is
perspective.
there an ordinance against that? Is there still?
Yes,
Really?
yes. Dog off leash.
Dog in Cemetery.
Dog in cemetery.
Soon
Yes.
to be a made-for-TV movie.
Yeah, well, being a media person, I kind of played dirty. I got a hold of Court TV. They sent a letter to the court saying they wanted to come out and cover this. All of a sudden, a lot of people in the court dug in their heels and were unwilling to negotiate. I mean, those are interesting times. So, yes, but I went out there for the My Cats Women, and it was disturbing because I hate to think that we use the long arm of the law and government power for things like this. I think we need more people who are willing to stand up and bring attention to these issues. And I was disappointed to see that this kind of a heavy hand would be used. So when Judge Collette was saying that he wondered why somebody would follow this, what he doesn't know now is he's sort of like waving a red flag. I will be out for those hearings as well where they discuss the fines. Because I think even though their liberty is not threatened right now, it's still a big issue.
It's an amazing amount of money. I know that you can assess court costs, but that seems like an inordinate amount of court costs.
That would mean that the court costs were $150,000 if it's $47,000 for each, if they split it 3 ways. And I'd like to know, what are they paying their prosecutors and what are they paying their judges? Maybe a tad too much? I don't know.
Isn't democracy pretty?
Speaking of that,
Yeah, this will lead into
we are
another
joined, and I'm going to move my
Court-
webcam.
court watcher.
Court watcher. I'm going to move my webcam and introduce everybody to Emily Dievendorf, who is the new executive director of Michigan Equality. And tell me the various positions you just ascended.
Yeah. So
And it's been a rapid rise, really.
yeah, I was in the legislature. I was in the Michigan House of Representatives for about 8 years, working for two legislators, and then I left there and came to Equality Michigan as the policy director, so as the lobbyist. And did that for a couple of years and then took over as managing director, and I did that for a couple of years, and now I'm officially executive director. So it was my way of saying I'll stick around.
Yeah.
And I will be sticking around, and I plan to be here until we win marriage and amend our state civil rights act, and I'd like to see second parent adoption happen, and I think it's important that a leader be there for the long haul and establish those relationships and make sure that we have a mission that we execute.
We don't want to lose you, but I hope that you succeed in achieving all of those things sooner rather than later.
And I think that we will. I think I might be out of a job sooner than I expect.
Oh,
So,
I hope so.
yeah,
but
yeah.
We've thought that in the past about certain things.
Yeah. I think what we should expect is that we are going to have a lot of loose ends to have to tie
I
up.
agree. This is WLNZ LCC Radio, 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. We're talking with Emily Dievendorf, who spent the past week in the courtroom in Detroit in what is a landmark case. I think many of us thought, again, that this would be decided by now, but the judge did not issue a decision. First of all, he didn't issue a decision without a trial, so it went to trial last week.
Right.
And then last Friday, he announced that he would not be announcing his decision. It will be coming soon. Do we have any idea when soon is going to be?
He indicated that the decision, his contemplation time, should take a couple of weeks. So we expect the week of St. Patrick's Day. He has a number of documents he wants to go over, a lot of studying, and perhaps questions he wants to ask of the different legal teams. But he said he doesn't want longer than that because he wants it to be fresh in his mind.
Is there a sense that he's taking longer on this case because he thinks that this will end up at the Supreme Court and he wants to make sure that his decision has all the I's dotted and T's crossed?
I don't know that it necessarily has to do with where he thinks it's going to end up. I definitely think that he wants all the I's dotted and T's crossed. I think that he is establishing a wealth of information and documentation that we haven't seen across the country in almost any other case. Unfortunately, it shows how off the wall Michigan is, but I think that it accurately represents the opposition's argument, not just in Michigan, but across the country.
Now, how many days were you there?
I was there all but 2 days of the trial, so 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Oh, it was
And-
2 weeks.
Yeah,
Following it, I'm not sure if it was just in the news, but probably on your Facebook page,
yeah.
there were some moments of absurdity, weren't there? Like, what? Tell us about the opening witness.
Yes. Well, we had our side, of course, had the first week of testimony, and we presented a lot of science, a lot of data. What was absurd, even in presenting our side, was we opened our case, and even in our opening statements for both sides, the AG's legal team asked that there be a standing objection to any mention of second parent adoption throughout the whole case, and this started as a second parent adoption case. This started as a case to talk about parental rights, and the judge suggested that the couple turn this into a marriage case as well. So the AG's team asked that from here on out, that any consideration, any mention of adoption, that the judge know that they have an objection to us talking about it at all. And of course, all of the experts, the data that they presented was to show that LGBT people created damaged children.
Right. Now, did the judge agree with that?
He
It would
noted
be- he
that
noted
there
it.
would be a standing objection.
Okay, but he allowed the testimony to go forward.
Yes.
And some of the experts that they brought in, their research even on that topic was quite specious. Wasn't it one of the first witnesses who was simply not allowed to even testify?
It was a couple of witnesses in. They had a young, not quite professor, not quite lawyer, not quite fully educated in anything. But that was the standard quality of all of their witnesses. Well, all of their witnesses that were allowed to offer testimony did have degrees, were scientists of some kind. For the most part, were not specialized in the area of social science. They were economists, they were demographers, and so they were able to go back to the point of saying that the sample size of the studies was just too small. When, of course, we know that in social science studies, when we're looking at psychology, when we're looking at sociology, the standard sample size is smaller so that we can get a better idea of what a family looks like and the dynamics within the family. So the experts that were asked to offer testimony for the other side really had not done studies on LGBT families. In fact, there was one expert that offered testimony that had done 25 studies in his career, and 24 of them had been on the NBA, on vegetables, and on pornography, and one of them had been on LGBT families.
Did you say NBA, vegetables, and pornography? Okay.
Separate
it's not one
studies.
Yeah, that's what I was
separate
wondering.
studies.
Separate, comma.
those were separate studies, but yeah, one of them had been on LGBT families, and even that one study did not consider the factors that we would have to consider if we were to look at what actually impacted the academic outcome and success of children raised in LGBT homes. In
Right.
fact, it didn't even pay attention to whether kids had been raised by LGBT parents, just whether a kid had been raised by a parent that had been in a same-sex relationship at one point.
So the study itself was really not going to be able to find that, even if it were done properly and correctly. So that, yeah. And I think we've seen other judges simply refuse to hear even any of that. I was
Right.
surprised the hearing went on for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
It did seem to bring a lot of attention to the issues and a lot of the things that were said. Did you read the comments in various various news sites?
I make a habit of not reading the comments.
That was good.
Yes, Yes, I absolutely don't, because we do in the LGBT community and movement, we know what the opposition position tends to be, and honestly it was humiliating and degrading enough to have 2 weeks of just having to make the case for getting married revolve around whether we were going to raise children that would not be able to be successful in the world. When really there is no data that supports that we wouldn't be excellent parents.
Oh,
And when really marriage shouldn't depend on parenting. There isn't a rational basis for denying two people committing themselves to each other or taking care of each other for a lifetime and having the resources to do that well, and tying that to raising children.
Did anyone bring up the obvious question of how much better do heterosexual parents do? I mean, was that? Let's not be
Let's be
absurd.
honest about it, yes.
Yeah, the AG's legal team mentioned a number of different things, and that's where a lot of the absurd statements came out. One of the experts said that we need a man and a woman in a marriage, and one of the reasons that we need that is because a woman can domesticate her partner.
Oh, yes.
And it was asked whether that can happen in a relationship between two people of the same gender, and the expert said that he thought perhaps a woman could domesticate another woman, but
Can't be
yeah,
real.
I know.
but he said
Oh.
that he didn't think that could happen in a relationship with two men, and he used as an example fraternities and gangs.
Oh,
So
yes.
yeah, the answers were really quite offensive and didn't make a lot of sense. And also, something that struck me throughout was that there was no understanding, or at least no admitted understanding, that sex and gender are completely different things.
Yes.
So, what
One is a biological
Right,
fact, and the
exactly,
other one is a
exactly.
socially constructed fact.
Exactly. The parts you have on your body
Yes.
have absolutely nothing to do with the role that you play in your family and the characteristics that you have and what kind of parent you should be. So if what we need in the family is a parent that is sensitive and that plays with their child, and that also is able to discipline their child in a constructive way, and is also able to be firm, but is also able to be nurturing, then we should be asking that all parents have those characteristics, rather than to say that they should come in a package of in a female and in a male, so that parts go with certain characteristics. And it was all just very ridiculous and ignorant.
Many decades ago, I worked in an office where a heterosexual young friend of mine came back to the office and announced that she was pregnant, and I blurted out, "I guess they lowered the standards." She never spoke to me again.
No, understandable.
Yeah.
She was quite the exuberant soul. I couldn't imagine anybody tying her down long enough to be able to take care of a baby.
Yeah.
She did a great job.
Yeah.
I think the only problem that the couples face, and this is what I find so ironic about these court cases, is the stigma that the community and some of those trolls we read on the news sites bring to the situation, because they make the lives of some of these kids miserable.
Right.
If there's also not a good program against bullying in schools, and
Right.
unless there are enlightened people who are in the community explaining to kids who may not come from tolerant homes why this is not something to be castigated. And I think they these cases sometimes only make it worse.
Right. Well, that was very interesting to me as well. Is the experts tried to prove over and over again that children in families with LGBT parents didn't do as well in school, when really they failed to show that academic performance was significantly influenced by whether a child has an LGBT parent, and they failed to show that those children were actually raised in homes with LGBT parents. But in addition to that, they didn't take into consideration all those other factors. We never once throughout the trial talked about the impact of discrimination on creating stress within the home.
Yes.
So we never talked about how an LGBT household has to deal with the fact that we might be facing discrimination, or the child might be getting bullied for having LGBT parents, or the child might be getting bullied for any number of things, for feeling the stress of the discrimination that comes with having LGBT parents, the economic discrimination, the higher rates of homelessness or substance abuse, all those things that happen when there's extra stress on a home. We never had the conversation of what discrimination does to a household.
You know, when you're talking, it kind of you could have this similar trial 20 years ago of mixed race marriages.
Mhm.
I mean, the same kind of
It's the
absurdity,
same arguments.
same arguments.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's none of it made sense. What kind of media presence was down there covering this trial?
Well, that was a little disappointing. We actually had some really great bloggers from around the country. We had the Detroit News there. We had the Detroit Free Press. So Brian Dickerson and Laura Berman were there. But the national news paid very little attention to,
Really?
to this case. They would pick up on it every once in a while, but they didn't pay very close attention to this. And this is only the third trial since Prop 8. So this is
I hadn't realized. I mean, this is
Yeah.
an important national issue, an important national trial.
Mhm.
It started before some of the bigger headlines with things like Ukraine and so forth might have driven it out of the
Yeah.
news. That's disappointing.
Yeah, and we had bloggers come from across the country to get Regnerus on record, that expert
Yeah.
that created the discredited study that everybody was talking about in the news, because he hadn't been on trial yet.
Oh,
He hadn't been
no one had let him
a
testify.
witness, right?
Ah,
And he is the witness that actually had his own university come out the day before he was to
Yes.
offer
That's serious
testimony.
that's
business.
devastating.
Yeah, yeah, and basically say that they could not stand by his work
Right.
and announce that the American Sociological Association also did not stand by his results. And that is just incredible for your employer to say about the work that you've done and the quality of the work that you've
Was
done.
that in any way, could have that been introduced into the trial?
Well, yeah, it was actually.
It was, okay.
was.
Wow.
Well, feeding that kind of intolerance, which is what that research does, leads to things such as the heterosexual couples who throw away their children, who literally, if they find out that their child is, comes out to them, that then they throw away that child, kick them out of the home. We see higher rates of teen suicide among young people because they have so much difficulty if their parents are unaccepting. We see some of the same groups that are involved on the opposite side from you in this case, working with the people in Uganda. And I just posted this morning on Facebook a brutal picture showing what's happening there after insisting that they wouldn't pass the law that really criminalizes just being gay, to the point that they were going to have the death penalty, but now it's just life in prison, I gather. And so many of the groups here in the United States have been going down there and feeding that and talking about why this is why we're fighting so hard in the United States to preserve marriage between a man and a woman. We now see a man who was burned alive. This is the kind of violence against the LGBT community that is being fostered by these attitudes. So it seems the real problem is on that side.
Every second of this case was about proving that we are less valuable and fall lower on the hierarchy of human beings. And the Attorney General's side tried to downplay that. They announced several times that it was sad that the public and the media was trying to make this about people being against gay people or religion playing into research, or they essentially tried to say that we were throwing up red herrings to say it was about anything but that we weren't ready for it. But to say that we LGBT people need to be studied for potentially 20 more years before they can be sure we're okay to be trusted with anything, to be trusted to live like regular human beings. We are. It is just so insulting, because the whole time we were referred to like we are in a petri dish, and we were born yesterday.
Yeah.
And we have families. That we exist. We already have families, and our ability to care for each other and our children is being disabled.
I understood too that Attorney General Bill Schuette came out and during the trial and announced that even if the judge did go ahead and throw out the law, that he didn't want any of the county clerks issuing marriage licenses until after he had a chance to appeal, and that appeal wound its way through. What do you think will happen? I don't think very many of them are necessarily going to follow his lead, are they? Do they have to?
Well, certainly Lisa Brown feels that she doesn't necessarily have to, and um, he
I think
did.
Barb Byram may follow
Yeah,
suit
yeah.
here in
Barb
Hennepin.
Byram she is an incredible champion for our community, but also she feels like it falls within her job description to serve her constituency. Um, he did this last time. The Attorney General did this last time. Sent out a letter at the last minute when county clerks were ready. And actually, Equality Michigan has a database right now that lists all the county clerks that have already announced that they are ready to go, and it lists clergy members in every county that are ready
Really?
to marry people. Yeah,
Oh,
and justices of the peace.
we still have those?
Yeah, that are ready to marry people. So in case there is a window, people have announced where they're going to be, and county clerks have announced what the procedure is, and we are pestering any county clerks that have not responded. And the state has already changed the forms.
Oh, have they? Oh,
Yes.
that's funny.
Yes, we have gender neutral applications. We have gender neutral marriage licenses. So everything is in place. The only person that has their heels dug in right now is our Attorney General. The rest of the state has already lined up, and our county clerks are ready. We have some county clerks that when Equality Michigan calls, that they'll get a little bit pissy, and they'll say something like, "We will follow the letter of the law." Click. But the fact is, if the letter of the law says that, they have everything they need to step up and make it happen.
So what do we expect then? We expect a decision in a couple weeks, and much to just as Justice Scalia, he suspicioned that it would happen, that if these laws were kicked out and enough people got married, it would force equality across the country, because it is obviously discriminatory. You can't be married in one state and not married in another. That's absolutely bizarre.
Yeah.
And so it will likely lead to this. Michigan has, the recent studies have shown just a dramatic shift in public opinion. It's no longer that I think the Attorney General will find it's an effective wedge issue. It's not. I mean, the majority of the people in the state now favor same-sex marriage. So what's going on here? Why do we have so much foot dragging?
I think you're correct in all of that. I also think that Michigan is different in that our Attorney General doesn't care. I don't think that rationality is necessarily behind a lot of the decisions that he's making on this, and their defense is a great example of that. There was nothing that they could actually stand behind as a great explanation for why the state has a rational basis for protecting the ban. There was really nothing. It was all very humiliating to them, or it should have been. It should have been.
What was the demeanor of the Attorney General that was prosecuting this case?
We certainly examined that throughout the case. When you're sitting there and feeling what you're feeling, to hear people talk about you in that way, with that complete lack of respect, somebody like me, I try to have compassion for those that work against us, and I would just watch them, hoping that there was some kind of conflict that they were having with what they were doing, knowing that they're hired to do this.
Right.
And they seem to be having a really good time.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
They seem to be having a really good time, and to have
Good
a bit
club.
of a swagger to them. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think, we figured out that at least one of them seemed to really believe in it. Another one seemed to be really arrogant, and a third one maybe might be having a hard time dealing with it, but was down with it at the time. So, I always have hope that they'll figure out that they were wrong, and
This is the
everybody
AG's
will.
office that had AG, Deputy AG, or Assistant AG Andrew Chervell,
Yeah.
who was busy stalking a student at University of Michigan, and because he was so incensed that the man was fighting for gay rights at the university, and he really went after him. It was an ironic case. I had personal dealings with a student who had a run-in with Mr. Chervell.
Yeah.
And I mean, he was really way out of plumb with what you would think would be typical demeanor on the part of somebody from that office. You have to wonder about the culture in that office.
Yeah, although that was Mike Cox.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, yeah, and
But there's been a long tradition in that office, hasn't there?
Yeah, and Equality Michigan was behind that hard push to get Chervell out of there, and at the very least, they were able to say, well, state resources were put towards all of that hate. But
Yeah.
there is a tradition of not necessarily being champions for us.
Does
But
the judge, the federal judge, have any history in how he rules on cases like this that you've analyzed?
from what we've noticed of Friedman, he seems to be a really reasonable judge. He really seems to be wanting all the information that he can get on this, and he called them out several times on them not being forthright in what they were presenting, and them not considering a number of factors when they were talking about their studies. And I really do think that he wants all of the information so that he can present the most informed decision. And I have some confidence that this is going to go our way, at least where Judge Friedman's decision is. What we expect is that from there, it's likely going to either be stayed immediately, or that
But the AG
yeah,
took an
yeah,
injunction.
yeah. I think our only question is whether Friedman's going to stay it or not.
Yeah.
And we expect that he'll probably stay it.
Really, you think he'll do? Yeah, he's
Yeah.
been somewhat cautious on
Yeah,
that, hasn't
yeah.
he?
He still is a conservative judge. He's
Okay.
generally a conservative judge, but he's a reasonable judge and a reasonable person. And we expect it to be appealed to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. And we don't want to assume that it will be overturned after that, but we should expect it to be challenged and challenged and challenged and delayed and extended. And in light of that, I have to continue with my come at it from all directions approach. And that is my approach to everything. But from what we've seen at the national level, we have to just assume that we cannot afford to lose ground. We have to keep building that foundation. And I have to assume that we need to still be going to the ballot in 2016, because Michigan is a completely different kind of animal. And those courts that would come after this are not going to be so friendly.
And it's going to take a long time otherwise.
Right.
And time is wasting for families that we
Right.
saw, for example, the family in this case. I mean, it leaves these families in limbo. There have been news accounts recently of couples that have decided to leave Michigan, talented
Yes.
couples, because they just feel that it's too unsettled here.
Yes.
And they can't count on, am I going to have spousal health insurance? Am I going to have these rights or not have these rights? And
Right.
that's going to be costly to our state if we don't find a way to conclude this.
Yeah,
we know
we-
it's coming.
We actually, the day of the closing arguments, we put out a member email, and we asked people to send in their stories as to why marriage matters in Michigan to them in the LGBT community. And stories have been pouring into my email account every day, and a lot of them are not in Michigan anymore. A lot of the people
Yeah.
I'm hearing from are not in Michigan anymore.
And that's sad.
So they want to tell me why it matters, but it matters because they've given up.
You know, a very conservative friend of mine said to me, I just ran into him at a store the other day, and he says, and he was agreeing with this case, the LGBT side. He said, now, tell me again what's wrong with people wanting to get married? It's like, I didn't expect it from him. I
Yeah.
really didn't. But
Yeah.
One of the points in the trial, one of the witnesses for their side was asked what the divorce rate was for heterosexual couples. And of course, we know that it's fairly high. And he pretended like he did not know that. And he tried to say, well, on a daily basis, I don't know how many people get divorced on a daily basis. On a weekly basis, I don't know on a weekly basis. And then he gave some like 30%, and we're all in the audience, kind of just trying to inch it up, because a point that I try to make is we are asking to sign on to this traditional institution. We're saying we want to commit ourselves to each other for a lifetime. And what we see in other states is that once you pass marriage for the LGBT community, within the first couple of years, more than half of all LGBT couples that the census has documented live in the state are married.
Yeah, they flock to to get the license. Yeah.
In Utah, within the first 2 weeks, 60% were married.
Wow.
so here's Utah, which would be,
Right.
you would think, the last state on the face of the earth almost,
Yeah.
except for Mississippi. No,
There's a few more.
but they've got this law,
Yeah.
Right.
protection.
It's very bizarre.
It really is.
I mean, when we fall behind Utah, we ought to know that it's time to make a difference.
Yeah.
But we're seeing that kind of foot dragging go on here that is really worrisome. I'm going to bring up another odd situation that I just became aware of today, which was the award, the Zoltan Ferency Award, going to Milton Scales.
Oh, yes.
What a strange thing that was. And I cannot imagine knowing, as I did, and I had an opportunity to know Zoltan. He was both a colleague at MSU, but I also knew him because he was my first big political interview when he ran for governor on the Human Rights Party.
Yeah.
He was kind enough to grant me an interview. And he took this fledgling journalist and he just treated me so well. And he was such a wonderful man. I cannot imagine him being happy about this award.
Yeah. And I am glad that Milton wants to see this passed at the state level. I am
do too,
happy
yeah.
that anybody wants to see us amend Elliott Larson, but there is no reason not to make sure that we're protecting as many people as soon as possible at the local level across the state. We should be trying to stop the harm and suffering as soon as we can, as much as we can. And he was the no vote.
Scales was the only one to vote against. The Meridian Township had an ordinance. And this is what we're seeing. And the ordinances serve two purposes. First of all, they carry some weight in the community and they set a guideline and a set of standards, but they also educate the community as the process goes on. And if enough communities become educated to these issues, that's why I think you see these surveys switching so quickly over just a few years where people's attitudes change because there's stories in the local newspaper.
Yeah.
They see that it's their friends and neighbors who are making these arguments and not people it's easy to, oh, these are people I don't know, they scare me. Well, then, no, it's my neighbor. I didn't realize that. Well, and all of a sudden it changes minds so quickly. Zoltan was not a policy wonk.
Yeah.
He was good at getting into the weeds on things like proportional voting. That was his big issue before he died. But he was not someone who would have taken this stand. He would have still said, I believe that, to me, that was, Scales' objections were procedural and they were tactical. And they weren't really principled. He wasn't arguing against the principle of equality at all. In fact, he was saying the penalties should be harsher.
Right.
It just struck me as the wrong. There were so many other good cases that they could have, good examples.
He said it had little teeth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That it wasn't, it wouldn't have had enough bite to be able to make much of a
Who
difference.
sits on that committee that chooses the
I don't
annual?
know, but I
I'm
hope
kind of
we
curious.
find
I'm
out.
going to go look. 'Cause I'm kind of curious where they are coming from because they don't know Zoltan. I knew Zoltan. He gave me the shirt off his back literally once.
Did he?
Yeah, and he didn't have any shirt on under it.
That figures.
I complained about his campaign T-shirt, voting for Zoltan,
Yeah?
that it shrunk. He took his shirt off and gave it to me at a public event.
Oh.
It was like, what? That's who he was.
It was. Don Riegel very carefully would take off his jacket and throw it over his shoulder. It was a very studied move. But Zoltan would literally give you the
He
shirt
walked
off.
around shirtless. It was the
He
funniest
was
thing I heard.
maybe the most cheerful. I mean, he was probably the most effective as well because he was so cheerful. He kind of, I often think Michael Moore is in the same tradition. Makes fun of things, very amusing, very funny, and really gets people to pay attention because he knows how to use humor. But I think he would be unhappy with this
Oh,
one.
absolutely.
I just wish they would have consulted with the One Capital Region group that was working with the community to organize because they knew who the champions were. They knew who was putting in the blood, sweat, and tears to try to make this happen. And
that to me I was very disappointed because it just isn't in the spirit that Zoltan would have appreciated, I think. And I have such great affection for the man that I would hate to think that his memory was in any way tainted by this. Milton may have his reasons for doing what he did, but I don't think that certainly justified an award.
Well, I hope that as awards sometimes do that Milton takes that and is inspired to become a champion for Elliott Larson.
Yeah. Because this is only one of the issues. I mean, one of the stranger things about the case that was, we hope we'll have a decision soon, is that it did start as an adoption case. That is another huge issue. And then there are the workplace issues.
Yes.
And I wondered if you could speak to what the status is of those two as this grinds on.
And explain what they wanted for adoption the situation.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people are surprised when they learn.
Yeah. April DeBoer and Jane Rouse are a couple and have been together for a while, and they're two nurses, and they have 3 children, and their children are special needs, and they wanted to co-adopt each other's children because, of course, when you cannot have legal right to your children, then a number of different issues come up. and access to children, medical access to your child when you need to get them at school, but also when a parent dies, when a parent, if the relationship ends. So they wanted to be able to provide for their children. So they tried to sue in order to ensure that they could co-adopt their children, because in Michigan there isn't a law that says you can or a law that says you can't, and judges had been instructed to not allow second parent adoption to LGBT families. And Judge Friedman, when they went to him to try to sue for second parent adoption, he said, well, really, the real reason you're not able to co-adopt is that your relationship is not recognized by the state because there's a ban on marriage equality in Michigan. So
And because we have DOMA.
right. So I suggest you take that back and challenge the marriage ban in Michigan. So that's how this case started.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we're in court now looking at both issues. And it is interesting that we were in court looking at second parent adoption, we were looking at marriage, and then while we were there, because you become kind of a community, everybody that watches the court for 2 weeks, and most of us are the LGBT community. And as we were leaving, one of the people that had been watching court with me said to me, my partner has only been here a couple of days, and she's afraid of being here because she doesn't want to be on camera, because she's not protected in her workplace, and it's not a friendly workplace, and she's afraid of being fired from her job if they see she's here at this trial, because they don't necessarily know that she's gay. And then that brought it all the way home.
Wow.
That in Michigan you can still be fired for being gay. And what's of course fascinating about this case is, even if we won this case, even if we had marriage equality in Michigan, they would be able to get married, but they could get married. She could go to work married to her partner, and if they found out she was married, they could still fire her for being gay perfectly legally without any legal recourse.
Right, and they don't even have to say. It's
Right.
just that's perfectly acceptable. This is LCC Radio, WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. We're talking with Emily Dievendorf, the Executive Director of Equality Michigan, about the recent court case in Detroit that we hope will be decided soon, but it's only one piece of that overall puzzle. And really the three main issues that are facing the community right now would be the overturning DOMA, or finding a way legally to overturn it, or a ballot proposal to do so. Those are two options. Dealing with the addition of the issue of second parent adoption, but also the incredible problem of discrimination and employment status. Now, those are ordinances that are going through some of the townships around the state. What's been your success rate with those so far?
We are second in the nation to Pennsylvania. We have the most local non-discrimination ordinances in the country, and we've passed over 10 in the last year. So we passed in the last, just a little over the last year. Last year we passed 10, and we are up to 32 now. So once we pass 33, we're even with Pennsylvania, and we're about to pass them. So that is really exciting, because at this point, despite the fact that we're all over the state, passing at the local level, we have protected just about 20% of Michigan citizens from employment discrimination and housing discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity.
Would those laws take precedence? Or is that still a debatable point?
Yeah, the teeth is still the how strong they are, how much we can enforce them. It's really up to the local municipality, and that's part of the problem. We lack uniformity, and we lack a way to make sure that we can regulate these things. We need a statewide oversight. We need uniformity. So there's only so much that we can do, and we need some way to have the backup that state law provides.
One of the things we learned from the way in which some of these DOMA laws were passed was that ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which writes model legislation from a conservative point of view, shares it with states so that they can just sort of pull an off-the-shelf idea from them with all the pieces in place and all the language written and pass it. Is there a similar organization that's doing the same thing for the ballot proposal, for example, that you're taking a look at? for the future?
Well, in Michigan, we have one for the marriage ballot
Yeah.
proposal. In Michigan, we have one of the most restrictive bans on marriage equality, um, and it's pretty easy to write the question that would have to both repeal it and put into place full marriage equality. So we would have to construct our own unique question. But certainly there is always model language. There's always model language for just about everything that we have to do now. That is the amazing place we're at with the LGBT movement. Is we're making enough progress and we're a well-oiled machine. So the agent has it right to a certain extent. He talks about our war room and he talks about how big a movement we are and how well funded we are and what big tools we are, or well, not that we are, but that we have. He might be the tool, but well, what he is wrong about is that we're not huge. We don't have an army that is so big, and we don't have a lot of money, but we have the research and we have the organization and we have the messaging. We at this point
And you have being
have
on the right
organized.
side of history, I think.
You're right, right. The people are on our side, and we know that because we've done the polling. We actually bother to find out where people are. We don't step ahead without knowing exactly where everybody is, and we don't have to fake the numbers. We're never going to tweak science. It doesn't do me any good to pretend people are somewhere where they're not going to be, because then I'm not going to know what I need to do in order to help them to realize exactly what LGBT families need and why. And that's why we know now that in Michigan, as of a couple of weeks ago, we did a poll and support for marriage equality is at 57%. And
That's amazing.
yeah, and
That's one. I mean, that's such a turnaround because somebody was just making the argument before your poll came out. Well, it's still not a majority in Michigan, and then your poll came out. It was, oops, those are words that people have to eat now.
Yeah, and they believe in Michigan, they believe the ban is unconstitutional at 59%. They believe their own vote to put it into the constitutional, to put it into the Constitution. They believe it was wrong, and now they believe that it's unconstitutional to have it in.
People have opened their eyes.
Yeah,
and that's really pretty much what it takes.
Yeah.
Now, was there anything in your side of the case that you thought you may have been a little weak on, or some of the experts that you presented? Where's your weaknesses?
Yeah.
I know that's a hard question to answer. It's probably not very fair, but.
Well, I really do feel like we were disabled in that we were unable to talk about, we were unable to put things in context.
Courts are bad for that, aren't they?
It's very interesting to me that when you take an issue like this, a social science issue, and you put it into a courtroom, you talk about one leg of something, and you can't talk about discrimination that way. You can't talk about how a group of people is impacted by something and just talk about the result of an LGBT family on children, without looking at everything that happens to an LGBT family. You can't do that. And basically all that was thrown out were numbers and no explanation of the numbers. We weren't allowed to talk about an explanation of the numbers.
Well, as you were just talking about, if the family has economic instability because of the dangers of one or more members being fired from their jobs, that's a strain on a family that a heterosexual family doesn't have, but that is not their fault.
So essentially we talked about the fact that the family has instability.
Yeah.
We were allowed to say the family has instability. So we said that like that was an insult to the family and representative of a defect in the family. But then we weren't allowed to say that it was economic instability. And we weren't allowed to say that the economic instability was caused by other factors that might have been caused by socially imposed discrimination.
One of the issues is that there has been a religious undercurrent in a lot of this, and separation of church and state is a critical issue when you start to talk about constitutional issues. Was that part of this case at all in the courtroom?
Every single one of their witnesses was asked at a certain point, and they were asked because it came out in their depositions prior to the trial, what their religion was and how they felt about gay marriage. And they were all part of very conservative Christian denominations, and they were all anti-marriage equality. And one of the witnesses, it ended up catching fire and coming out in the media, went so far as to admit that LGBT individuals were going to hell.
Hand in a handbasket. I said
Yeah.
that. Yeah. It's like,
Essentially, if LGBT people would not repent, that we would be going to hell, and it was very very interesting to see the arrogance that was behind that. And then
Yeah.
there was the question of, do you think that belief informs your research? And of course, everybody said no.
Right.
But some of them said that it was part of what made them interested in studying LGBT families. So they would claim that it didn't inform their research and that it didn't cause them to come up with the results that they came up with, but it caused them to ask the question.
To do that
Right.
kind of research.
was there any overlap on if they studied creationism or?
They did not want to ask questions about their own religion. It didn't. They did not seem interested in questioning their own beliefs.
Well, we keep hearing that the Republican Party has decided that it needs to expand its tent. And the log cabin Republicans, who are the representatives of the LGBT community within the GOP, are trying to pry those doors and those tent flaps open. But at the same time, we see that Dave Agema still has a job on the Republican National Committee, despite some clearly homophobic remarks and really worrisome remarks on a number of different issues.
Yeah.
Is that a bellwether of when the party gets serious and when they will start getting rid of the Dave Agemas in the world and say, we won't want you representing us? Should we use that as a bellwether of where the party stands?
I think choosing leadership is a huge indicator of where the party is. I do know from discussions with Republicans that most of the Republicans that we have in Michigan, their own personal priorities and political priorities don't match up with Agema's. That's absolutely true.
The powerful and wealthy
Right.
ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Betsy DeVosses and they want him gone, but
Yeah.
they haven't been able to dislodge him.
Yeah, and even those that are not the Betsy DeVosses, but perhaps what we should be wondering is if those who are in leadership that also are pro equality or are at least not extremist in the Agema sense are not willing to also take a stand or to ensure that their leadership represents something that is not destructive, then is that leadership?
It is. It's worrisome. And I had thought by now that we would have seen a change in that leadership because there's been a drumbeat for quite a long time to say that that would be a good first step to show that they really want to emphasize a sort of renewed openness. And I think many of the people who originally, as you said, who may have voted one way, have rethought the issue.
Yeah.
And they may not be too ready to reject their former selves, but they feel they've moved on and that clearly the trend is in this direction. And they should move on and start worrying about other issues that they care about more. So I'm hoping that we do see some changes in this. Will you come back when the decision is?
Absolutely.
Okay. What's next? What are you going to be doing now that you have all this free time? You don't have to be in court.
There is no free time. So
you have an office
yeah,
here and an office in Detroit, and you make your trip back and forth.
So we are starting to plan a year of messaging around marriage and laying the foundation for debuting the marriage ballot campaign to ensure that we have everything set up regardless of what happens in the court. And the second that I got out of the courtroom, then I went back to planning that.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Emily Dievendorf. We hope to have you back soon with good news on your part.
Yes.
And please join us next Monday night for another edition of Lansing Online News with Bonnie Bucqueroux and Bill Castaneer. And this is LCC Radio, WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan, from the bowels of the Abel Sykes Learning and Tech Center down in the basement where we grow moss every Monday night. So we'll see you again next week. Thank you very much. Wonderful.